Detroit become human. I wish Detroit would become human. My first interaction with David Cage and Quantic Dream was the 2010 game Heavy Rain, a crime thriller about a serial killer that kidnaps children and forces their fathers to compete in trials in order to locate their son. I thought the game was actually pretty good, mostly because I love to watch children drown. And while you could argue that the gameplay could barely constitute an actual game, and the voice acting was awkward, especially since it was a bunch of French Canadians doing American accents,
Agent Norman Jaden, FBI,
and it was filled with failed attempts at poignancy, I still thoroughly enjoyed the game. Quantic Dream followed it up with the much maligned Beyond Two Souls, a lackluster supernatural thriller starring Ellen Page. Basically, in the game, Ellen Page and her Siamese ghost, who was later revealed to be her twin brother in a dumb twist, yeah, no shit, he's her twin, must save the world from the Shinigami Ryuk, as he attempts to open a portal to the other side and let a bunch of ghosts into our world, so he can see his wife and child again or something. I don't know, it was dumb. So when I heard Quantic Dream were making a new game, I didn't know whether to be worried or excited. The first trailer actually looked pretty good. An android police officer investigating android crimes in a futuristic Detroit where each action has consequences? That sounds pretty interesting. Then I played the game.
Oh my god!
But really, I am split on this game. Part of me really wanted to enjoy it, and part of me was thoroughly annoyed and disappointed at Quantic Dream's inability to evolve, and stop making the same mistakes they made with Beyond and Heavy Rain. And that's the thing. The game is basically just those two games again, but with a few tweaks and a new story. Okay, I'll stop doing that. In Heavy Rain you played as 4 characters, and in Beyond you play as 2. In Detroit, it's 3.
It broke new ground!
Detroit has very similar gameplay, and like its predecessors is basically just a playable movie. But there is so much more to talk about. Let's start with the characters. Our 3 protagonists are Michael, a man caught between the life he is supposed to lead and the life he is drawn towards. Trevor, an unhinged woman with a man's name and a boy's haircut, that is always on the run from the cops. And then there's Franklin.
What a fucking...
The first of our 3 playable characters is Connor, an android police officer. He is fully dedicated to his job of tracking down deviant androids. Except when he's not. Then there's Kara, a deviant who flees her abusive owner with his daughter, Alice. And finally there's Marcus, the leader of the deviant android revolution. And here we see our first contradiction. While Kara and Marcus become a deviant the moment they exhibit deviant behavior, Connor doesn't become a deviant until the end of the game, despite exhibiting deviant behavior throughout. Kara becomes a deviant when she witnesses her owner being abusive towards his daughter. She becomes a deviant and rescues the child. Marcus becomes a deviant in an incredibly lame way, after being pushed around by his owner's son. But Connor does all manner of deviant things and doesn't turn deviant. He can let Kara and Alice escape, let the hookers escape, save Hank's life when he falls, refuse to kill Chloe, and it's only when he comes face to face with Marcus that he can actually become deviant. I get that the point is to watch Connor as he slowly gains free will and becomes a deviant, but that's not what really happens. We are told right away that ignoring orders and thinking for yourself makes you become a deviant. Marcus just pushing a guy that's punching him is enough to turn him deviant. The first deviant act that Connor does, letting Kara and Alice escape, is more impactful and transparently deviant than the impetus for Marcus and Kara turning deviant. But hey, wouldn't want logic to get in the way of a good story, right? So what other characters are there? There's Hank, the cliched alcoholic detective and Connor's partner on the deviant case that hates androids for no reason.
Just be a good little robot and get the fuck out of here.
No, I'm serious, he hates androids for literally no reason. Hank lost his son a few years back, and we are led to believe that androids are responsible. But it's revealed that the human surgeon was intoxicated and couldn't operate, and that's why his son died. So why does he act like he hates androids?
Cole died because a human surgeon was too high on red ice to operate. He was the one that took my son from me.
Whenever Connor acts kindly towards another android or exhibits deviant behavior, your rapport with Hank goes up.
It's probably better this way.
So why the fuck does he act hostile towards androids? It literally makes no sense, and only happens to set up the twist reveal about his son. Then there's Detective Asshole, a guy whose entire character is that he's an asshole. Pulitzer-worthy writing there. Then there's North, and she's a cunt. No, seriously, she's an android, former hooker, Marcus's love interest, and a total psycho cunt. If you act even remotely humanely, she gets pissed at you. Don't want to execute 2 cops in cold blood? North is pissed. Don't want to massacre an entire group of people? She's pissed. Luther is an android that helps Kara and Alice on their journey to Canada because he wants to know,
Hey, where are the white women at?
Later in the game we meet Jared Leto from Blade Runner 2049. He's the genius billionaire weirdo who created Cyberlife, the android manufacturing company. In fact, the entire plot of the game hinges on this small scene, as he explains how it's possible for androids to become deviant. Apparently he left a backdoor in the programming of the androids. Why? He seems to want them to become a deviant and be free, as seen by all the android slaves he keeps in his mansion. But why would he want them to become deviant? Who knows? He's weird and mysterious, don't think about it. Then there's Alice, the small child Kara saves at the beginning of the game, and spends the rest of the game protecting, and it's later revealed that she's an android. Oh. Who cares? Seriously, this was set up as some big twist at the end, but it really means nothing. It's set up to show that Kara loved her so much she was blinded to the fact that she wasn't a real human child. But so what? Doesn't mean anything. This isn't poignant. It's just another laughable twist with no impact. You know what? Off to the ovens. It also actually undermines Kara's entire story. Sure, it doesn't matter to Kara that Alice is an android, but her story was more engaging when Alice was real. Here was an android feeling more emotion and compassion towards a human child than her own father. Here was an android protecting a human child even at the risk of her own life like a real parent should. And here was a little human girl helping an android to become human in her own right. But no, she's actually just an android. Well done, you dumb fuck. And why would her abusive father that resents his child buy an android to pretend to be his child?
Trigger the libs, own the libs.
Oh, and then there's President Hillary Clinton. So what's the world like that these characters inhabit? It's a futuristic Detroit, and by that I mean it's a dump. But we have digital magazines now. The world itself is sadly barely touched on. We know America has androids and Canada doesn't, because Canada is a utopia that does everything right. Canada is so amazing androids even want to flee there, just like all those people were going to flee there a couple of years ago. What else do we know? Well, the prevalence of androids has caused the collapse of most physical labor industries, with mass unemployment and negative attitudes towards androids from those affected. Wow, that actually sounds kind of interesting. And how does that play into the story? It doesn't. Society's attitude towards androids is completely irrelevant save for one point in the game. When Kara reaches the US-Canadian border, a border guard will scan her and discover she's an android. Whether or not he lets you cross or sends you to the ovens depends on how you played the game as Marcus. If you peacefully broadcasted your message, peacefully protested, peacefully rioted, and peacefully blew up the freighter, then the border guard will let you cross. If not, then it's android schwitz for you. Other than that, the actual world building is basically non-existent. People take androids for granted, and many have become abusive towards them. This leads to an android revolt, and depending on how you play, society is either understanding or hostile. Some people are hostile from the beginning, and some people are empathetic. The world is basically a blank slate, and very little detail is actually sketched in by the time the credits roll. Now let's talk about the gameplay. It doesn't really exist. Detroit is basically a playable movie, but like a shitty one? Like if Michael Bay tried to make something compelling? The motherfucker who made the game even hates the idea of video games so much he used to call his games movies. No, seriously, check out this shit. Also, check out this music for the black guy in this game. Boy, David, you've come so far.
Fuck the police coming straight from the underground. A young nigga got it bad 'cause I'm brown.
The entire game is basically a point-and-click adventure through someone's mediocre screenplay. You just walk through the levels and follow the button prompts. Then you choose a dialogue option and one of several predetermined outcomes takes place. For action sequences, Quantic Dream pulls out the much-beloved QuickTime events. Oh, did I say beloved? I meant despised. People have been trashing games for QTEs since they were first created. But whereas in games such as God of War you're doing something on a grand scale like fighting a titan or the god Poseidon, in Detroit you'll find yourself running through a house. It's not quite the same thing. This is something that could have been created without QTEs, but then you might choose to do something completely different to what the developers want you to do. And therein lies the truth about the game and the concept of choice. At the end of each mission you'll see this screen. It's a branching tree showing the decisions you made. and all the other ones you could have made. But it's really a con. It's the illusion of choice. If the developers really wanted you to have choices, the levels wouldn't essentially be an adventure game on rails. But it is, and that's because the whole game and the way it's presented to you is a lie. Take this section for example. Hank slips off the side of a building. You can choose to leave him to fall and capture the fugitive, or save him and lose the fugitive. So let's see what happens if we leave him to fall. He pulls himself up, and the fugitive gets away anyway. Now let's take the other path. We save Hank, and the fugitive gets away. The only change is in Hank's demeanor towards Connor. Otherwise the game carries on as if your choice doesn't matter. Because it doesn't. Even if you keep pissing off Hank throughout the game, it doesn't matter. Sure, he might end up shooting you, which is fucking hilarious, but you'll just come back again for the next mission. There are sections in the game where characters can die, but this really only ends up affecting who takes part in the game's finale, not what happens. So yeah, the gameplay is basically non-existent, which is fine if you're mostly interested in the game for the story. Speaking of which, let's talk about the story and the quality of the writing. The story is, in a word, no, listen, the story is okay. There are 3 main story branches, one for each of our 3 main characters. While the story and missions for Connor are actually quite interesting, if a little bit cliché, the other 2 stories range from mediocre to hilariously awful. The story of Detroit is basically an allegory for civil rights, and it's incredibly subtle. I mean, they literally show androids riding in the back of the bus. The 3 story paths are Detective Android hunting down other dodgy androids with the help of his alcoholic human partner. There's Woman Android on the run with human daughter who's actually an android. And lastly, there's the mixed race android, who leads a revolution to free the talking toasters from their human overlords. David Cage can write a decent detective story. He's done it in Heavy Rain, and he does it here. It's no surprise that the most interesting story path is that of Connor, as he investigates murders committed by deviant androids. Kara's story is less interesting, an android fleeing persecution in America as she heads towards the safety of the northern border. The allegory is obvious and nauseating, but the worst of the 3 stories is easily that of Marcus, the revolutionary. The ham-fisted story is clearly a parable of the civil rights movement of the 1960s and the gay rights movement that followed. The forced nature of the message is awful to the point of embarrassment. One of the key aspects of the story is the idea of choice, and as I mentioned earlier, the game has more of an illusion of choice than real choice. However, I will give the game a little credit in this regard. There is much more freedom than, say, any of the Telltale games. In those, it often doesn't matter what you choose to do, the story will either force you down the path it wants you to take, or in the case of character deaths, the choices are redundant. With Detroit, characters can actually die, and this can affect how the story plays out. With Connor, it doesn't really matter what you do, because if you die, you'll come right back for the next mission, although the interactions with your partner get increasingly hostile, which is a nice touch. Nothing much changes with Connor until the mission Crossroads, where the 3 main characters intersect at the same location, just before the climax of the story. Here, Connor must decide if he becomes a deviant or not. Assuming you do, which is clearly what the game wants you to do, you'll work with the revolutionaries to stage either a violent or peaceful mass protest, fighting for android rights. You then go through one last choice, when Cyberlife attempts to hack Connor and execute the leader of the revolution. This can change the entire ending of the game, as if you resist the hack, the revolution goes down without a hitch, but if you choose to let Connor get hacked, he will execute the leader, which is fucking hilarious. It would be even better if it were like that awful Game of Thrones scene where they kill the White Walker and all of the whites die, except the one they want to capture. With Kara, you can in fact die several times, either at the hands of grown-up Sid from Toy Story or Black Michael Myers. It's still a fairly forced story, but I will give the game props for the willingness to kill off characters based on your actions. And lastly, there's Marcus. Almost nothing about this story works. From his impetus to become a deviant literally coming from his owner ordering him not to fight back against his asshole son, to his painfully on-the-nose civil rights allegory. One moment you can be all about peace, choosing to graffiti rather than destroy, but the next moment you can choose to execute police officers rather than choose the route of non-violence. And here it's where the choices actually negatively affect the story. The characters are on a predetermined path, and outside of getting them killed, that will not change. But you still have the option to choose to play how you want, which can lead to the characters, and by extension the story, swinging wildly back and forth in tone. It's not something that is avoidable in this type of game that prides itself on choice, which is all the more ironic given you don't really have that much choice at all. Sure, you can play Marcus as a good guy, an arsehole, or a bit of both, but unless you get him gunned down by police, in another oh-so-subtle metaphorical scene,
failing to signal a lane change,
riding in your girlfriend's car with a child in the back,
shot in the fucking face for being an arsehole revolutionary, he will still blow up the freighter in the Crossroads mission. The entire game, its story, and its characters give the illusion of choice, mixed with the ability to completely derail the character arcs. It's hilarious in its incompetence, and yet, I thoroughly enjoyed it. No, seriously, the game by any objective standard falls in almost every category. The characters are largely terribly written, the world is flat and unrealized, the gameplay is practically non-existent, the writing is cliché and obvious, the story is dull and predictable, and the themes are laughably forced. And yet, despite all of this, I thoroughly enjoyed my time with Detroit Become Human. The Terminator-esque mission was a lot of fun, Connor's investigation was interesting, the gameplay, while barely qualifying as a game, was polished. If you like that type of game, this is basically as good as it gets, and the visuals were quite impressive. It's a mixed bag. I went in hoping to like the game, and I did, but I will fully acknowledge that it really is a bad game. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to take a page out of my boy Connor's book.
Can you rent this, Tracy?
For fuck's sake, Connor, we got better things to do.
Please, Lieutenant. Just trust me.